We've now reached presentation 14 in the series we were looking at in this book of Leviticus. Again, let's just look back at the previous presentation. We saw that Leviticus 25, some quite amazingly enlightened social legislation, from which we had much to learn today. It's based on that simple principle: food, shelter, freedom, security. If you like, the right or entitlement for every human being. And we looked at the broad ways our societies have been organized in the recent centuries, and the flaws of both systems. Communism carried to extreme accumulates all the wealth in the hands of the state, which means in the hands of the ruling elite. Capitalism does exactly the same. It leaves most of the wealth in the hands of the few, and the majority do not get very much. We can learn a lot from Leviticus 25, from the principles it sets up. It organized society in what I've called sevens. The seventh day, a much-needed break from the routine of hard work. We work best when we work that way. The seventh year in an agricultural society with no way to restore the land. Land fertility was restored, people got a break, but it also gave provision, increased provision for the poor, the refugees, and the dispossessed. And then the seventh year, the 49th year, every half century, all property, all land was restored to the original owner. Now you see, that prevented the accumulation of wealth in the hands of the few. We need to find some way to achieve that today. The land, there's a picture of the land area that they possessed. This little strip of fertile land, the bridge between Africa, Europe and Asia. But it belonged to God. If you like, God lent it to this people group as a secure base because God wanted to reach out through this people group and show the nations around about himself. That was their destiny. The land was given to the people to fulfill a destiny, to make God known to the peoples of the world. And they did that by living quality lives. And Leviticus gives us guidance in how that is to be carried through. And retaining the land is conditional on these. That's why the land was given. It's not owned by anybody. It was given to fulfill a destiny. The whole Jubilee concept, if you like, the 7 times 7, but every little detail of it, it undermined the way societies always go, where the wealth ends up being accumulated in the hands of the few. But it also strengthened family unity and responsibility, something that is deteriorating in the West today. The people could get together on the days off, but it also gave them a time to think of God, to worship and gratitude, but to take their social responsibilities for the have-nots of society. It was the outworking of this great moral principle, loving one's neighbour. Our agenda is the best for the other. So it worked this out in social responsibility and family unity. But we saw how Jesus picked up a passage from Isaiah which refers to the Jubilee model, and he applied it to himself. Jesus fulfills this Jubilee model and brings the freedom, the fulfillment, the way of God to his people. Now our society today is very different. There's no way we could apply this exactly the same literalistic way that it's in chapter 25 here. We are not an agricultural society. But the principles still stand. And if we organized our societies based on these principles, life would be very much better for an awful lot of people. The have-nots of society. God had rescued the people from slavery. He'd promised them security in a new land. He gave them directions for living in the desert, which was a pretty brutal experience. He then gave them directions for how they were going to live in the new land they were moving towards. As it were, he'd set the boundary conditions for success. If you live your lives this way, you can't fail. It's wonderful. And it was all done because God had a destiny for the nation. They weren't his favourites. He called them, gave them this land and the responsibility, because they had to live for God, and by living for God they had to make God known to the people groups round about. That was their destiny. Now against that, chapter 26 emphasizes obedience. The principles of doing it God's way releases blessing. Rejecting it forfeits blessings. And the final chapter, wisdom in responding to God. And implicitly this implies the dangers of careless, superficial response. And we're going to move into this area in this presentation. Now I'm going to read much of chapter 26 straight through without much comment, and then we'll try to bring it together to make it into some sort of coherent sense. If you follow my decrees, that's the boundary conditions, and are careful to obey my commands, I will send you rain in its season, the ground will yield its crops and the trees their fruit, your threshing will continue until grape harvest, and the grape harvest will continue until planting. You will eat all the food you want and live in safety in your land. I will grant peace in the land. You will lie down and no one will make you afraid. I will remove wild beasts from the land, and the sword will not pass through your country. You will pursue your enemies, and they will fall by the sword before you. 5 of you will chase 100, and 100 of you will chase 10,000, and your enemies will fall by the sword before you. I will look on you with favour and make you fruitful and increase your numbers. I will keep my covenant with you. You'll still be eating last year's harvest when you will have to move it out to make room for the new. I will put my dwelling place among you, and I will not abhor you. I will walk among you and be your God. You will be my people. I am the Lord your God who brought you up out of Egypt so that you would no longer be slaves to the Egyptians. I broke the bars of your yoke and enabled you to walk with heads held high. What a promise to a rabble of escaped slaves moving through the barren desert to a new land. But notice the first bit of the first sentence. If. It's conditional. Don't keep the conditions. This is what happens. But if you will not listen to me and carry out all these commands, if you reject my decrees, my boundary conditions, and abhor my laws, and fail to carry out all my commands, and so violate my covenant, that's the agreement I've made with you, then I will do this to you. I will bring on you sudden terror, wasting diseases, and fever that will destroy your sight and sap your strength. You will plant seed in vain because your enemies will eat it. I will set my face against you so it will be defeated by your enemies. Those who hate you will rule over you, and you will flee even when no one is pursuing you. If after all this you will not listen to me, I will punish you for your sins 7 times over. I will break down your stubborn pride and make the sky above you like iron and the ground beneath you like bronze. Your strength will be spent in vain because your soil will not yield its crops, nor will the trees of your land yield their fruit. If in spite of these things you do not accept my correction, but continue to be hostile towards me, I myself will be hostile towards you, will afflict you for your sins 7 times over. I will bring the sword on you to avenge the breaking of the covenant. When you withdraw into your cities, I will send a plague among you, will be given into enemy hands. When I cut off your supply of bread, 10 will be able to bake your bread in one oven, and they will dole out the bread by weight. You will eat, but you will not be satisfied. And it goes on. If in spite of this you still do not listen to me, but continue to be hostile towards me, I will turn your cities into ruins and lay waste your sanctuaries. I will take no delight in the pleasing aroma of your offerings. I myself will lay waste the land so that your enemies who live there will be appalled. I will scatter you among the nations and will draw out my sword and pursue you. Your land will be laid waste, your cities will lie in ruins. Then the land will its joy in Sabbath years all the time that it lies desolate, and you are in the country of your enemies. Then the land will rest and enjoy its Sabbath. All the day that it lies desolate, the land will have the rest it did not have during the Sabbaths you lived in it. As for those of you who are left, I will make their hearts so fearful in the lands of their enemies that the sound of a wind-blown leaf will put them to flight. They will run as though fleeing from the sword, and they will fall, even though no one is pursuing them. They will stumble over one another as though fleeing from the sword, even though no one is pursuing them. So you will not be able to stand before your enemies. You will perish among the nations. The land of your enemies will devour you. Those of you who are left will waste away in the lands of their enemies because of their sins. Also because of their ancestors' sins, they will waste away. But there is a bit of hope. But if they will confess their sins and the sins of their ancestors, their unfaithfulness and their hostility towards me, which made me hostile towards them so that I sent them into the land of their enemies, then when their uncircumcised hearts are humbled, and they pay for their sin, I will remember my covenant with Jacob and my covenant with Isaac and my covenant with Abraham, and I will remember the land. For the land will be deserted by them and enjoy its Sabbaths while it lies desolate without them. They will pay for their sins because they rejected my laws and abhorred my decrees. Yet in spite of this, when they're in the land of their enemies, I will not reject them or abhor them, so as to destroy them completely, breaking my covenant with them. I am the Lord your God. But for their sake I will remember the covenant with their ancestors which I brought out of Egypt in sight of the nations to be their God. I am the Lord. These are my decrees, the laws and the regulations that the Lord established at Mount Sinai between himself and the Israelites through Moses. God took this people, rescued them from slavery, was taking them through the desert, would take them into a land which had a great fertility as a base to reach the world. He was giving them boundary conditions, guidance, so they could live fulfilled lives in the land and fulfill their destiny as the people of God. That was the covenant God made with them. All he wanted was their response. Here is a picture of two possibilities arising from that response. But it raises questions. Big question for us today. Now the answer lies simply in language. This is what we call a Hebrew idiom. It's simply a way of saying something. We've got idioms in our language. We speak of somebody driving us up the wall. Now, we do not mean that they're literally driving us up the wall. But we all know what being driven up the wall means. This is an idiom. It cannot be taken literalistically, translated into English, and interpreted in terms of the literalistic English translation. It is an idiom. Fundamental basis that lies behind Leviticus is that God is love. Now that means that God only wants the best for us, all of us, all the time. God cannot send disasters. So what does this mean? Let's explore this a little bit further. You can look at this in several ways. Let me just look at it in two ways. If the people just disregarded the boundary conditions that God had given, if they decided they knew better, they could run their lives their way, and they weren't going to listen to God's directions, then they were squeezing God to the margins of life. What they were basically declaring was, we know better than God. And they pushed God to the margins of life. And if God's at the margins of life, then his protection and power are no longer there for us. As a result, disasters can happen. That's one way of looking at the idiom. Here's another way. When we choose to ignore God's boundary conditions, God's boundary conditions are designed. He made humanity. He knows what's best for us. And when we choose to ignore them, then our lives and the wider society, it just starts to fall apart. It's open to deterioration and collapse. And when a society gets weakened and collapses, it's ripe for takeover. That happened to the people of Israel. Now, if you look at Deuteronomy 28, and I invite you to look at this after the presentation, you will find the same pattern there. And it all expresses something that's rather fundamental. That's what the Hebrew idiom means. Your decisions, your actions have consequences, and they are inevitable as night follows day. If you thumb your nose at me and ignore my directions, the consequences are inevitable. I've kind of built them in. I know the best way for life. I know the best way you can fulfill your destiny. If you choose not to go that, well, you'll miss out. Actions have consequences. That's what the Hebrew idiom means. It's not that God directly sends it. He's built it in that when we live his way, we get the best. We are fulfilled. When we try to do it our way, we don't know the best, and we get the consequences. Things fall apart. And they fall apart badly. Actions have inevitable consequences. Now let's look at the blessings that are listed and the removal of the blessings. I've kind of summarized these in broad categories. Fruitful harvests. The alternative is the harvests fail or they're stolen. Now that happened frequently, that the people groups round about looked at the fertile land, came to the harvest season in the autumn, they came in and they stole them. And the people of God didn't have enough food. Peace and security, or it's lost, with inevitable fear. When a society is strong, it is peaceful and secure. Other people don't come and just steal things from them. A society is strong when it lives following the boundary conditions that God has specified. Victory. The land was fertile. It was attractive for pillaging for nations round about. The people needed to have that peace, security and strength of a strong society that was united. Strong families make a strong society. God's boundary conditions are laid down. When that weakens, they're open to attack. If you live God's way, your body works best. When we don't, we're open to illness and disease. When we live God's way, the promise of numerical growth. Children are protected and grow up. They're not knocked out by early disease. They'd come out of slavery. The last thing they wanted was to go back to slavery, and yet the passage speaks of them being enslaved in other lands, which actually happened on a number of occasions. But centrally, when we do it God's way, we bring ourselves under the umbrella of God's provision and protection. When we choose not to do it God's way, God's pushed out to the edge, and the umbrella of His protection and provision is no longer available to us. It's an inevitable outcome, a consequence of our decisions. The writer is painting a sharp and vivid picture of challenge to the people as they were preparing to move through the desert and eventually to enter this land. There are conditions for success. You can summarize it this way: the blessings involve peace and security. We all want that. And we all want an adequate food supply. We all want health. And families and children bring great honor. We don't want to be the slaves of others, being pushed around. God's presence, to know that you are wanted and valued and loved. But the passage brings in the possibility of restoration if people come to their senses and realize they've got it wrong. Big principle there. Blessings come from living within God's behavior boundary conditions. That's the practical way we treat each other and our environment and ourselves. When we follow God's directions and instructions, any piece of machinery will function at its best when it's run according to the Maker's instructions. We are no different. There's cause and consequences. Now, if you track through what actually happened, it's a frightening story. God was pushed to the margins of life when they got into the land, and after a short period of time and things were quite good, God was pushed to the margins of life. Then the nations round about started to pillage things. And people lived in fear. They did reduce religion to ritual performance. You can see the picture vividly in a book like Micah or Isaiah. But the poor were being ripped off at the same time. That steadily developed in the nation. A ruling class and the wealth and power accumulated to them. The Jubilee principle had been lost, and the majority of subsistence farmers were exploited. Land was taken from them. They had no redress in the courts because the courts were being bought off by the wealthy ruling class. That's a terrible danger. And as I present this picture, so much of it has repeated itself in the West in the last 100 years or so. But in the end, the leadership of the nation willfully rejected Jesus, what God was saying to them through the life of the suffering servant. At various times they lost the land. The northern part went into exile, never to be returned. The southern part went later into exile. Some of their descendants were restored. But in the end, they rejected the word of God, what God was saying to them. They ran the ritual religious performance with a ruling class running the nation for the benefit of themselves. When challenged by Jesus, they had him eliminated brutally. And in the process, they signed the death knell of the nation. They lost the land forever when the Romans flattened it in AD 70. Now let's move forward. When things really go badly wrong, we often, even the most hardened atheists, will cry out to God and say, if you get me out of this mess, and they make some rash promise. Or sometimes in a moment of spiritual excitement when we're really close to the Lord, we make some statement and vow of commitment. Chapter 27 looks at us making our promises to God. In the terrible moments of life and in the high moments of life. Speaks about a vow. Spoken words, spoken voluntary. We have committed ourselves or someone else to some action. We decide, I'll live for you, God. I'll serve you all the time. I'll work for you full time. I'll sell my house and give the money away. It could be whatever. In Leviticus 27 it speaks about people. You give yourself, or indeed some of your family. You can see the picture with Hannah, who gave away her son that she so longed for, gave Samuel to the temple. That was a vow. She kept it. And Samuel was greatly used by God for the blessing of many. Now, if you can't fulfill the vow this chapter deals with, you must do something in replacement, and it determines the value of what you do. And age and gender come into this. Men are valued more highly than women simply because in the agricultural society of the day, they had to do the physical work just for the families to survive. People could say, I'll give you these animals, but the animals had to be perfect. You didn't give them any rubbish, or you had to give them value equivalent to it. If you gave your house, the priest was involved in signing the value, so it was objectively determined. If you gave away your land, well, the nearness to Jubilee year determined its value. The principle of keeping vows by some kind of substitution, and the prices that are set are high. In fact, the prices for people, animals, and houses involve several years' earnings. But redeeming land was low because if you gave it away, how could you live? You couldn't grow crops. Perhaps a foolish vow. If you go back to Deuteronomy, it speaks of burnt offerings and sacrifices, tithes and special gifts, what you have vowed and your freewill offerings, and the firstborn, your herds and flocks. Now, if I reorganize this and bring in Leviticus with it, I can come up to 5 categories. There's the mandatory sacrifices which are laid down in the early part of the book of Leviticus. These are the prescribed Levitical sacrifices made in the tabernacle and eventually in the temple. A tenth of agricultural produce. The first new life. Things that we voluntarily commit to God, ourselves, our families, animals, property, land. And this one, which is mentioned later in the chapter, called devoted things, almost impossible to translate. And that mainly is in the context of warfare. Come back to some of these in a moment. Now, the mandatory sacrifices, if you look back, these are related to human rebellion. They're putting it right so that we can approach God and go His way, recognizing that we mess up again and again and again. But we want to put it right, and we want God to put it right for us, and we want to move forward to a better way. The next 2 speak of our gratitude to God. And if you think about it, the gratitude of God in an agricultural society is expressed in terms of produce and animals. Here was a slave nation, coming out of slavery, moving into the desert, moving through the desert into a new land with fertility. Wow! Gratitude for their new lives. The chapter speaking about vows, which is our voluntary commitment, things that we've entered in by choice. And that devoted thing speaks of total destruction. Leave that one hanging just for the moment. Now, these are the kind of broad categories that are involved here. I want to look at the tithe just for a moment. It's touched upon in this chapter. Now here are some early references to tithes. The first one comes in Genesis 14. The strange priest Melchizedek. You learn a lot more about him from the book of Hebrews in the New Testament. Abraham gives Melchizedek a tenth of everything. So the kind of principle there. Priests couldn't earn. They were provided for by the people they served. And in this chapter, it's 1/10 of everything from the land. If you didn't give it as produce, if you would put it in monetary terms, you added 20% to it. Numbers 18. And this shows where the tithe went. It went to the Levites, the tribe from whom the priests were drawn, to enable them to live. There were 12 tribes. If 11 of them gave 1/10 of the produce, then the 12th tribe, the Levites, who weren't given any land allocation, they were able to live. In Deuteronomy, various parts of chapter 12, which is where I drew the quotation earlier, a list of offerings, and it mentions tithes. And later in Deuteronomy, speaks about giving tithes, or the firstborn. The central sanctuary points to being one tabernacle, later one temple. But if people lived too far away, they could convert it to the monetary value, travel, and then convert the money back to tithes and offerings physically to give to the priests. There's the principle of tithing. Now let's look at devoted things. Difficult word to translate. Harem, written in two ways. No exact equivalent in English. But what this word stresses is that everything belongs to God. The accumulation of material possessions is not part of our ballgame. Now the word is only used in the context of war. That's its primary use in the Old Testament. And what it's basically saying is that any spoils arising from any sort of conflict, they don't belong to individuals. They belong to God. Now just think about that for a moment. It stops that. Many of the nations at that time, and indeed still today, go into war simply because it allows them to grab the spoils and enrich themselves. And indeed, many people, leaders, encourage their people to go to war with the promises that they'll get their bit of the spoils. Not so with God's people. That's not part of it. Sometimes we are attacked and we have to protect ourselves. If things work out well, all the spoils go to God. And anything that was burnable was burned. So you didn't take valuable clothes or property. Metal objects wouldn't burn so easily, at least with the technologies at that time. They were all given to the temple, where they'd be melted down and made into something useful. Wonderful principle. You'll see the opposite principle in the Quran, where the spoils of warfare come to the men. And this is part of the attraction of indulging in warfare. Not so with God's people. These are devoted to God, taken away. Wonderful principle here. It all goes up in flames, or as metal that gets given to the temple. And over time the temple accumulated a considerable amount of wealth, which it turned into the decoration and furnishings and finishings of the temple. But it's a strange final chapter, this idea of the vow. Why, it's there. What it's saying is, if you make a vow, you can't change your mind. You've committed something to God. Take it seriously, your response. Don't be irresponsible. But if you committed something to God and you want to substitute something else for it, exchange something, this chapter gives the ground rules. But you can't substitute something that would have been given as a tithe or something that would have been given as a devoted thing. It gives the principles of substitution so that we can fulfill our vows to God when we make a commitment to Him. But the principle ties very closely to the central themes of this book. And perhaps that's why this strange chapter does come at the end. Something that has puzzled people for a long time. It's possible for us to dedicate ourselves to serve God. We become the voluntary slaves of God. Now, Paul speaks about that, and it follows from the ways of Jesus. Total commitment to do it God's way, to give our lives, our abilities, our time, our money, everything, to serve God in some way. It may mean involved in serving other people, in practical things. It may mean travel. It may mean staying at home. And in some ways, that is part of the deep aspect of all of us who are the people of God, the followers of Jesus today. Now, in those days, the men who were born into the Levite tribe, they could fulfill that by working in the temple. Many jobs to be done there. But that wasn't open to the remaining 11 tribes, to the remaining 9 tribes. All God's people, if we look back to Exodus, were called to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. We were to reflect God's nature in our lifestyle and the way we treated each other and others round about. And we were to be the priests, the go-betweens, to make God known to the people groups around. That destiny has never changed for God's people today. Quality living generates impact, and others are drawn to Jesus. It's been described that way. To visibly embody the character of God. The only way God can see, people can see God in our society today or at any time, is to see Him embodied in the lifestyle of the people of God. Now there's a calling, there's a destiny. It was the destiny for the people of Israel. It's the destiny of the people of God today. That's practical. We can go through our religious rituals and religious performance as much as we like. If it doesn't come out in visibly embodying the character of God in practical living, in the ordinary things, in the ordinary jobs of life, then it's a complete waste of time, and the Old Testament stresses that throughout. Now, making our vows to God can be part of that expressed commitment. And there may be times in your life where at some activity or meeting or gathering you felt moved by God and you made some quiet commitment to God. Don't break it. That's what the chapter is saying. Because your vows are part of an expression of your total commitment to God. And if you turn away and break it, then your commitment is flawed in some way. This all weaves together the whole idea of what the book of Leviticus is saying. Carry them out. Or in this chapter it gives practical substitutes in the context of a desert people soon to enter a new land. Carry it out. Our commitment is serious. God has done all for us. He wants the best for us, and He wants us to fulfill our destiny. Let us carry it through, carry it out, carry it into the world, and let us fulfill the destiny that God has for His people. This was the great message that the book of Leviticus was bringing to the people at that time, as they were facing a long time in desert travels before they entered into their new future. What a great message from the book of Leviticus. Now, in the final presentation, I'm going to attempt to bring together some of the central messages from this book.